Welcome, dear listeners, to Miss Marple, Sinister Colonel in Willowby Forge, a delightful Miss Marple murder mystery in the classic style of Agatha Christie. Settle into your favorite armchair with a cup of tea as we journey to the quaint village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s. Here, our beloved elderly sleuth, Miss Jane Marple, uses her keen eye for human nature to unravel a puzzling crime. This cozy tale of intrigue and intellect spans 10 chapters, perfect for a relaxing listen. If you're navigating by chapters, timestamps are provided. And now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow over Willowby Forge. In the heart of the English countryside, where the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead cradled thatched cottages and ancient hedgerows, life unfolded with the gentle rhythm of a well-worn clock. The village, a patchwork of stone walls and flower gardens, seemed to hum with the quiet contentment of the 1950s. The church bells chimed softly on Sunday mornings. The postmistress exchanged pleasantries with every passerby, and the scent of freshly baked scones wafted from open windows. It was a place where secrets, like the wild roses climbing the vicarage wall, were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for a keen eye to uncover them. That eye, more often than not, belonged to Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster whose unassuming demeanor belied a mind as sharp as her knitting needles. Miss Marple lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the village green, its windows framed with lace curtains that fluttered gently in the autumn breeze. Her days were filled with simple pleasures, tending her roses, sipping Earl Grey, and observing the comings and goings of her neighbors. To the untrained eye, she was merely a kindly old lady, her white hair neatly pinned, her blue eyes twinkling behind spectacles. But to those who knew her well, Miss Marple was a master of human nature, capable of drawing parallels between the smallest village squabble and the grandest of crimes. "People are much the same everywhere," she would say, her voice soft but certain. Whether in St. Mary Mead or Timbuktu. On a crisp October morning in 1952, the tranquility of St. Mary, dashing young man from London. It was Mrs. Price who raised the alarm that fateful morning. At precisely 7 o'clock, as was her custom, she had carried a tray of tea and toast to the Colonel's study, a room lined with leather-bound books and military relics. She knocked, received no answer, and, assuming the Colonel was lost in his papers, entered. There she found him, slumped over his mahogany desk, his face gray, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The teacup he had been drinking from lay shattered on the floor, its contents pooling darkly on the Persian rug. Mrs. Price's scream echoed through the manor, startling the rooks from the nearby oaks. By 8 o'clock, the village was abuzz. Constable Slack, a young officer with a penchant for efficiency but little patience for nuance, arrived at Willowby Forge with his notebook in hand. He was followed closely by Dr. Haydock, the local physician, whose weathered face betrayed a mix of concern and curiosity. The study was a scene frozen in time, the Colonel's pen still clutched in his stiff hand, a half-written letter on the desk, and a faint, peculiar scent lingering in the air. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his brow furrowed as he examined the Colonel's lips, which bore an unnatural blue tinge. "Poison, I'd wager," Dr. Haydock said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "No signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle. But there's a faint, almond-like smell, and his pupils are dilated. Cyanide, perhaps, though I'll need to confirm." Constable Slack scribbled furiously, his face pale. "Suicide, then?" he ventured, glancing at the shattered teacup. "Or murder?" Dr. Haydock shook his head. "Too early to say. The Colonel was a healthy man, save for a heart condition I treated with digitalis. But this is something else entirely. Word of the Colonel's death spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead. By mid-morning, villagers gathered in hushed clusters outside the post office and the Blue Boar Inn, exchanging theories over cups of tea and pints of ale. Was it the Colonel? Reminds me of old Mr. Fortescue, years ago. Poison in the tea, you know, though that turned out to be quite a different matter. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. I think I shall take a walk to Willowby Forge. A basket of scones might comfort Mrs. Price in her distress. Dolly raised an eyebrow but knew better than to question her mistress. Miss Marple's walks often led to more than neighborly concern, and the village had learned to trust her instincts, even if they didn't always understand them. By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was making her way up the winding path to Willowby Forge, her basket swinging gently on her arm. The manor loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by autumn's golden light. She noted the overgrown rose bushes, their thorns catching at her skirt, and the faint creak of the iron gate, which seemed to protest her arrival. At the door she was met by Mrs. Price, whose face was blotchy from crying, but whose posture remained resolute. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price said, clutching her apron. "It's dreadful, just dreadful. The Colonel, gone like that, and in his own study." There, Miss Marple said kindly, patting the housekeeper's arm. "You must tell me everything, my dear. It's always best to talk these things over." Mrs. Price led her to the drawing room, where the air was heavy with the scent of polish and old leather. As they sat, Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, taking in the faded tapestries, the ticking grandfather clock, and the photograph of a younger Colonel Hargrove in military uniform, his jaw set, his eyes cold. Mrs. Price recounted the morning's events, her voice trembling as she described finding the Colonel. "He took his tea alone last night, as always," she said. "I brewed it myself, Earl Grey, his favorite. I left it on the tray at 8 o'clock, and he was alive then. I swear it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging details. "And no one else was in the house? Only young Mr. Arthur, the Colonel's nephew. He arrived from London yesterday afternoon, but was at the Blue..." Slack puffed out his chest. "We're looking into the nephew, Arthur. Stands to inherit the manor, you know. And there's talk of a row with the vicar. I'll get to the bottom of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm sure you will, Constable. But do take care not to overlook the small things. They often tell the larger story." As she left Willowby Forge, the autumn sun dipping low, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity. The Colonel's death was no accident, she was certain, and the almond scent suggested a darker truth. "People are like gardens," she mused, her step slow and deliberate. "Weeds of deceit grow quietly, but they always leave a trace." She resolved to keep her eyes open, for in St. Mary Mead, even the coziest corners could hide a sinister shadow. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone lane that led to Willowby Forge. The manor's stone walls, draped in ivy like an old shawl, seemed to absorb the golden light rather than reflect it, as if mourning the loss of its master, Colonel Reginald Hargrove. The village was still abuzz with the morning's grim discovery. The Colonel, found dead in his study, poisoned, with a shattered teacup as the only witness. Miss Jane Marple, her basket of freshly baked scones tucked under her arm, approached the manor with the air of a neighbor offering condolences, though her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She had a way of seeing through the ordinary, much like a gardener spotting a weed among the roses, and today, her instincts told her that Willowby Forge held more secrets than its somber facade suggested. Miss Marple's steps were slow but deliberate, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. She noted the overgrown laurel bushes flanking the gate, their leaves curling with neglect, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the village chimneys. The manor's front door, heavy oak with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, creaked open to reveal Mrs. Edith Price, the housekeeper. Her face faded velvet curtains. The air was heavy with the scent of wax polish and old books, and a fire crackled fitfully in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A portrait of the colonel in his military days hung above the mantel, his stern gaze seeming to follow them. Mrs. Price poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot, her hands unsteady. "I've served the colonel for 20 years, she began, her voice thick with emotion. He was a hard man, mind you, but fair in his way. Never thought it had come to this. Poison, they're saying." She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers fidgeted, twisting the cloth as if it held her secrets. "Tell me, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said gently, sipping her tea. "What happened last night? You mentioned preparing the colonel's evening tea." Mrs. Price nodded, her eyes darting to the window. "Yes, miss. He always took his tea in the study at 8 o'clock. Earl Grey, no milk, 1 sugar lump. I left the tray outside the door as he liked his privacy. He was alive then, I'm sure of it. I heard him coughing as I walked away." Her voice faltered and she smoothed her apron nervously. "When I came back later to clear the tray, the door was locked. But that wasn't unusual. He often locked himself in to work on his papers." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "And no one else was in the house?" "Well, Mr. Arthur was here earlier. Mr. Arthur Hargrove, the colonel's nephew. Arrived from London yesterday afternoon, all charm and city polish. He and the colonel talked in the study for a bit, but he left for the Blue Boar Inn around 7. Said he was meeting friends." Mrs. Price's lips pursed slightly, as if she disapproved of such gallivanting. "And there was Miss Blackwood, that lady from London who called in the afternoon. She didn't stay long, though." Miss Marple's eyes brightened at the mention of Miss Blackwood. "An old friend of the colonel's, I understand." Mrs. Price hesitated, her finger assert control. "We're looking into young Arthur Hargrove. He's the colonel's heir, stands to get this manor and a tidy sum. Word is the colonel was rewriting his will, maybe cutting Arthur out. Gives him motive, don't it?" He glanced at Mrs. Price, who looked away, her hands still fidgeting. "And there's talk of a row with Reverend Clement over church funds. The colonel wasn't one to mince words." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the handle of her teacup. "Indeed. But motives are like threads, Constable. Sometimes they unravel when you pull too hard. Have you examined the study?" Slack frowned, clearly unused to being questioned. "Of course. The teacup's been sent for analysis and Dr. Haydock's certain it's cyanide. No fingerprints, though. The colonel's the only one who touched it. We found a half-written letter on the desk. Something about debts unpaid, but it's vague. Could be a suicide note." "Or something else entirely," Miss Marple murmured, her mind drifting to a case years ago in St. Mary Mead, where a letter had hidden more than it revealed. "And the sugar bowl, was it tested?" Slack blinked, caught off guard. "Sugar bowl? Well, it was on the tray, but we assumed the poison was in the tea itself. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. Assumptions can be dangerous, Constable. Like assuming a rose is free of thorns. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I mustn't keep you, Mrs. Price. Do take care, and let me know if you need anything. As she stepped into the hall, Miss Marple paused by the study door, which stood ajar. The room was as she'd imagined, a heavy mahogany desk, shelves of military history books, and a faded map of India pinned to the wall. The shattered teacup had been removed, but a dark stain lingered on the rug, and a faint almond-like scent hung in the air. Her gaze fell on the sugar bowl, still on the tray, its lid slightly askew. Beside it lay a single almond shell, peculiar for a study where food— Already? He teased, though his eyes held a flicker of concern. Merely stretching my legs, Doctor, she replied. But tell me, what do you make of the Colonel's death? Cyanide, you said? He nodded, his expression grave. No doubt about it. The symptoms are unmistakable. Blue lips, dilated pupils, that almond scent. Could have been slipped into his tea or sugar. I prescribed him digitalis for his heart, but this was no accident with his medication. He paused, glancing toward the manor. The Colonel and I had words recently, you know. He wanted to sell a plot of land I'd hoped to buy for a clinic. Stubborn old goat. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. Quarrels can cloud judgment, she said, but so can loyalty. Mrs. Price seemed quite devoted to the Colonel. Dr. Haydock shrugged. 20 years is a long time to serve a man like Hargrove. Devotion can wear thin. He tipped his hat again and continued on, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his words. As she reached her cottage, the sun dipping below the hills, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting in her lap. The threads of the mystery were beginning to form a pattern. Mrs. Price's nervous hands, Arthur's inheritance, Miss Blackwood's debt, the vicar's dispute, the doctor's land. And that stray thread on the apron, green as the laurel leaves, perhaps nothing, or perhaps everything. People are like gardens, she mused, her needles clicking softly. The weeds of deceit grow quietly, but they always leave a trace. She resolved to visit the village shop tomorrow, where gossip flowed as freely as tea, and where the next piece of the puzzle might be waiting. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The morning mist clung to the meadows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of thatched cottages and turning the village into a watercolor painting of greens and grays. It was the kind of autumn day that invited quiet reflection, with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke lingering in the air. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her woolen shawl, walked along the high street, her steps measured but purposeful. Her basket— Miss Marple stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly, and the conversation paused as 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "Good morning, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, setting her basket on the counter. "I thought I'd pick up some wool for my knitting. Such a chilly day, isn't it?" Her tone was mild, but her presence seemed to shift the air, as if the village knew her knack for unraveling more than just yarn. Mrs. Weatherby, a plump woman with a penchant for gossip, recovered quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? The Colonel, dead. And poor Mrs. Price near collapse, I hear. Do you think it was that nephew of his, Arthur? Always seemed a bit too slick, if you ask me." Miss Marple tilted her head, her fingers tracing the edge of a skein of blue wool. "Young men can be impulsive," she said thoughtfully, "but murder requires a steadier hand. Tell me, what do the village folk make of it?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer, her voice dropping. Some say it's suicide. Colonel Hargrove was a lonely sort, wasn't he? Others think it's that Miss Blackwood, the fancy lady from London. She was seen at Willowby Forge the day before, and they say she and the Colonel had words. And then there's the vicar. Reverend Clement had a proper row with the Colonel over church funds. My cousin saw them arguing outside the vicarage last week. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details like cards in a catalog. Dear me, so many opinions. But gossip is like a garden path. Sometimes it leads you astray. She paid for her wool and stepped outside, her thoughts turning to the vicar. Reverend Thomas Clement was a gentle soul, but even gentle souls could harbor secrets, as she'd learned from a case years ago involving a choir mistress with a hidden debt. Her next stop was the vicarage, a modest stone house beside the church, its garden bursting with late-blooming asters. Reverend Clement was pruning a rose bush, his wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. He was a slight man in his 40s, with a nervous smile darted toward the church. Of course, she said soothingly. Though it's curious, isn't it, how misunderstandings can fester. Reminds me of old Mrs. Grayson, who thought her neighbor was stealing her apples, when it was only the wind. She smiled, but her gaze lingered on a smudge of ink on the vicar's cuff, an odd detail for a man who rarely wrote letters. As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple's path took her past the Blue Boar Inn, where she spotted Miss Lavinia Blackwood emerging, her fur stole catching the sunlight. Miss Blackwood was a striking woman in her 40s, with dark hair swept into an elegant chignon and pearl earrings that gleamed with understated wealth. She carried herself with the confidence of a city dweller, but her eyes held a flicker of unease as she met Miss Marple's gaze. Good morning, Miss Blackwood, Miss Marple said, pausing. You must be finding St. Mary Mead quite a change from London. Miss Blackwood's smile was tight. A temporary visit, Miss Marple. I came to settle an old matter with Colonel Hargrove, a financial debt from our days in India. He was less than cooperative, I'm afraid. She adjusted her gloves, her movements precise. But murder? Preposterous. I was on a train back to London by 6 o'clock yesterday. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. How tiresome, these old debts, though I suppose they can weigh heavily, like a stone in one's pocket. She noted the faint scent of jasmine perfume and a smudge of red lipstick on Miss Blackwood's handkerchief, details that seemed to tell a story of their own. As the day wore on, Miss Marple made her way to the village green, where Dr. Haydock was taking his usual afternoon walk, his cane tapping rhythmically on the path. Miss Marple, he greeted, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Out collecting clues, I presume. Merely enjoying the air, Doctor, she replied, though her eyes twinkled. But since you mention it, what more can you tell me about the Colonel's death? Cyanide, you said. Dr. Haydock nodded, his expression sober. No mistake about it. The almond-like smell, the blue lips, it's classic cyanide poison. Cottage. The village settling into its evening hush. Miss Marple reflected on the day's gleanings. Mrs. Price's fidgeting hands and that green thread. Arthur's restless eyes at the inn. The vicar's trembling fingers and inky cuff. Miss Blackwood's guarded smile. Dr. Haydock's foxglove garden. Each was a thread in the tapestry of the mystery. The village whispers pointed to motives. Inheritance for Arthur. Resentment for Mrs. Price. A debt for Miss Blackwood. A dispute for the vicar. A land deal for the doctor. Yet something felt amiss, like a stitch dropped in her knitting. She paused by her garden gate, noticing a discarded vial half buried in the soil near the path to Willowby Forge. It was small, the kind used for medicine, but its label was missing. She left it undisturbed, knowing Constable Slack would want to see it. But her mind turned over its significance. Was it a clue, or a distraction planted like a weed to mislead? And then there was the overheard quarrel at the Blue Boar, where a barmaid had mentioned seeing a shadowy figure near the manor's gate the night of the Colonel's death. Gossip, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that even the wildest tales often held a grain of truth. Settling into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple let her thoughts wander. People are like books, she mused, her needles clicking softly. The covers may be plain, but the pages hold surprises. Tomorrow, she would visit Willowby Forge again, for the manor's walls, like the village itself, were whispering secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to listen. Chapter 4. Tangled Threads. The sun dipped below the hills of St. Mary Mead, painting the sky with streaks of amber and rose. The village settled into its evening hush, with the distant bleat of sheep and the soft clink of teacups drifting from cottage windows. Willowby Forge, its stone walls looming like a sentinel, stood silent against the twilight, its secrets. Dolly's eyes sparkled with the thrill of gossip, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her needles pausing only briefly. "A missing will, you say?" she murmured, setting her knitting aside. "That's very interesting, Dolly. But young men like Arthur are often too impatient for such careful crimes. Reminds me of poor Tommy Pierce, who thought he'd inherit his aunt's cottage, only to find it promised elsewhere." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think I'll take another look at Willowby Forge tomorrow. The manor has more to tell, I'm sure." The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the manor, her basket now filled with a jar of homemade blackberry jam as an excuse for her visit. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The manor's iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she noted a fresh scuff mark on the gravel path, as if someone had hurried through recently. Mrs. Price greeted her at the door, her face pale but composed, though her hands still fidgeted with her apron. "Miss Marple, you're too kind," she said, accepting the jam with a forced smile. "It's been chaos here, with the constable and his questions." "Quite understandable, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the hall. "A death like this unsettles everyone. May I see this study again? I'm sure it's a bother, but old houses fascinate me." Mrs. Price hesitated, then nodded, leading the way. The study was much as Miss Marple remembered: the mahogany desk, the shelves of military history, the faded map of India. The dark stain on the Persian rug remained, a silent reminder of the shattered teacup, now taken for analysis. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, landing on a locked drawer in the desk, its brass handle gleaming faintly. "The Colonel kept his papers here, I presume?" she asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Price nodded, her fingers twisting a stray thread on her apron. "Green, like the laurel leaves," Miss Marple noted again. "Yeah, something solid now. That missing will. Turns out the Colonel was drafting a new one, cutting Arthur out in favor of a military charity. Gives the lad a motive, don't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. A strong motive, perhaps. But strength can be deceptive, like a sturdy branch that snaps under too much weight. Have you considered the sugar bowl, Constable? Slack blinked, thrown by the question. Sugar bowl? It's just part of the tea tray. The poison was in the tea, Dr. Haydock says. Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, her eyes twinkling. But small things can hide large secrets. Like the time Mrs. Bantry found a clue in a teapot. She changed the subject, asking about the letter found on the desk, but Slack's answers were vague, his focus fixed on Arthur. As she left the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village's whispers. At the Blue Boar Inn, she overheard a barmaid mention a ghostly figure seen near the manor's gate the night of the colonel's death, a shadowy shape, cloaked in darkness, slipping through the laurel bushes. Probably just old Mr. Jenkins, drunk again, the barmaid laughed. But Miss Marple wondered. Red herrings often bloomed in village tales, but they could point to a truth, like a signpost half hidden by ivy. Her next encounter was with Arthur Hargrove, whom she spotted outside the post office, lighting a cigarette with hands that seemed steadier than the day before. He was a handsome man, with slicked back hair and a tailored suit that spoke of London's polish, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. Miss Marple, he said, flashing a charming smile. Come to join the village detective club? Hardly, Mr. Hargrove, she replied, her tone light. But I am curious. You were with your uncle the evening before his death, I hear? Arthur's smile tightened. Yes, we talked about the will. He was set on leaving Willowby Forge to me, said it was my birthright. But he was upset about the vicar, something about church funds. I left for the pub around 7, as half the village can confirm. Distraction. By afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the village green, where Dr. Haydock was tending his garden. Miss Marple, he called, waving her over. Still sniffing out clues? I'd wager you've got half the mystery solved already. She smiled, settling on a bench. Not quite, Doctor. But I'm curious about your foxglove. Such a lovely plant, yet so dangerous. He chuckled, brushing soil from his hands. True enough. Foxglove gives us digitalis. But cyanide? That's another beast. I checked the colonel's prescription, nothing amiss. Though I'll admit, our land dispute didn't help matters. He was stubborn as a mule. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the clues. The locked drawer, the powdery residue, the almond shell, the ghostly figure. Each was a thread, but some were loose, like a stitch ready to unravel. She recalled Mrs. Price slipping a note into her pocket during their last meeting. A shopping list she'd claimed, but her haste suggested otherwise. And the vial near the manor gate, labelless and half-buried. Could it have held cyanide? Or was it a gardener's discard? As she returned to her cottage, the village now cloaked in dusk, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed. The mystery was thickening, like a fog over the meadows. Arthur's alibi held, but his restlessness hinted at something unspoken. The vicar's tremor and inky cuff suggested a secret, perhaps trivial, perhaps not. Miss Blackwood's debt loomed like a shadow, and Dr. Haydock's knowledge of plants was too convenient to ignore. But Mrs. Price, with her green thread and nervous hands, seemed closest to the heart of it. People are like tapestries, Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking. The pattern seems clear, but the flaws tell the true story. Tomorrow she would dig deeper, for the tangled threads of Willowby Forge were beginning to form a picture, and Miss Marple was determined to see it clearly. Chapter 5. False Trails. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a chill that settled into the bones, the kind of autumn damp that made villagers linger by hearth and kettle. The village, nestled in its cocoon of rolling hills and thatched roofs, buzzed with whispers about the death of Colonel Reginald Hargrove, poisoned in his study at Willowby Forge. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, sat at her breakfast table, her knitting idle as she sipped tea and pondered the threads of the mystery. The green thread on Mrs. Price's apron, Arthur Hargrove's restless demeanor, Reverend Clement's inky cuff, Miss Blackwood's guarded poise, Dr. Haydock's foxglove garden, and the discarded vial near the manor gate. Each was a fragment, but the pattern remained elusive, like a melody half-remembered. Yet Miss Marple knew that even the most tangled skein could be unraveled with patience. Her musings were interrupted by Dolly, her maid, who burst in with fresh gossip. "Miss Marple, you won't believe it. Constable Slacks found a letter in the Colonel's study. A forged one, they're saying, pointing to Reverend Clement. Something about church funds being stolen. The whole village is talking." Dolly's cheeks were pink with excitement, but Miss Marple's expression remained calm, her blue eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "A forged letter, you say?" she murmured, setting her teacup down. "That's very curious, Dolly. Forgery is a bold move, like planting a weed to look like a flower. Reminds me of the Enderby affair, where a false note led us all astray." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think I'll visit the church today. Reverend Clement may need a kind ear in these trying times." The village was alive with activity as Miss Marple stepped onto the high street. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and freshly turned earth, and the church spire pierced the mist like a needle through cloth. At the village shop, Mrs. Weatherby was in full flow, her voice carrying to the street. "Embezzlement, that's what it is. Reverend Clement of all people. I only borrowed a small sum for roof repairs, temporarily, and with permission from the church council. The Colonel misunderstood, and now this forged letter makes it look like I had reason to do him harm." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the ink smudge on his cuff, now joined by a fresh one, as if he'd been writing in haste. "Dear me," she said softly, her eyes kind but alert. "A forgery is a serious matter. But the truth, like a good seam, holds fast under scrutiny. Have you seen the letter yourself?" Reverend Clement shook his head. "Constable Slack has it. He says it's in the Colonel's handwriting, but the ink's not right, too bright, not faded like his old letters. I don't understand it, Miss Marple. Why would someone do this?" She patted his arm, her mind turning over the detail. "People have their reasons, Reverend, often hidden like roots beneath the soil. Tell me, did anyone else have access to the Colonel's stationery?" He frowned, thinking. "Mrs. Price, of course. She managed his household. And Arthur was in the study that evening. Miss Blackwood visited earlier, but I can't imagine—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Stationery was common enough, but a forgery required intent and opportunity. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked toward the Blue Boar Inn, where she hoped to catch a glimpse of Arthur Hargrove. The inn was a cozy hub, its windows glowing with lamplight, the air thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke. Arthur was at the bar, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, his cigarette sending curls of smoke toward the ceiling. He spotted her and flashed a wry smile. "Miss Marple, come to interrogate me? I hear I'm the village villain now." "Not at all, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her tone light. "But I am curious about your uncle's will. Constable Slack seems quite interested. Focused on it." Arthur's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Slack's got a bee in his bonnet about that missing will. My uncle was empty, its label gone, but its presence was troubling. Cyanide, she knew, could be stored in such vials, but so could innocent tonics. Was it a clue, or another false trail? Her next stop was the village green, where she found Dr. Haydock inspecting his foxglove plants. "Miss Marple," he called, his weathered face creasing into a grin. "Still chasing shadows?" "Merely curious, Doctor," she replied, settling on a bench. "Your garden is thriving. Foxglove is such a potent plant, isn't it?" He nodded, brushing soil from his hands. "Potent and deadly in the wrong hands. But cyanide's not from foxglove. It's a different beast. The Colonel's death was no accident, though. Someone knew their poisons." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted his careful glance toward the manor, as if weighing his words. She nodded thoughtfully. "Knowledge can be dangerous, Doctor, like a tool in the wrong hands. Did the Colonel ever mention his plans for the manor?" Dr. Haydock shrugged. "Only that he wanted to sell a plot I'd hoped to buy. We argued, but nothing worth killing over. Still, I wonder about Mrs. Price. 20 years of service must have worn her down." Miss Marple's mind turned to Mrs. Price's fidgeting hands, and that green thread. At Willowby Forge, she found the housekeeper dusting the drawing room, her apron now free of threads but her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "More questions?" "Just a word, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I noticed a note in your pocket yesterday. A shopping list, you said." Mrs. Price flushed, her hands smoothing her apron. "Yes, just groceries. Nothing important." Her haste was telling, and Miss Marple wondered if the note held more than it seemed. As she walked home, the village now cloaked in twilight, Miss Marple passed the church, where a shadowy figure lingered near the gate, too fleeting to identify. The ghostly figure from the manor rumors, perhaps, glowing faintly under the last rays of an autumn sun. The air was sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke, and the distant chime of the church bell marked the hour with solemn precision. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl tucked tightly about her shoulders, stood at her cottage window, her knitting idle as she gazed toward Willowby Forge. The manor's silhouette loomed against the horizon, its ivy-clad walls hiding the secrets of Colonel Reginald Hargrove's death, poisoned by cyanide, his teacup shattered, his life extinguished in a single, calculated act. The clues she had gathered, Mrs. Price's green thread, Arthur Hargrove's restless alibi, Reverend Clement's inky cuff, Miss Blackwood's cryptic debt, Dr. Haydock's foxglove garden, the discarded vials, and the forged letter, were like scattered petals, beautiful but incomplete. Yet Miss Marple knew that even the most elusive flower could be pieced together with care. Her reverie was broken by a knock at the door. Dolly, her maid, entered, her eyes wide with the village's latest tidings. "Miss Marple, there's been a ruckus at Willowby Forge." Someone tampered with the Colonel's safe, pried it open, they say, and found jewels but no will. Constable slacks in a state, blaming Arthur, but Mrs. Price is pointing fingers at him for stirring trouble. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes twinkling. A tampered safe, you say? How intriguing. Like a locked box in a nursery tale. It promises treasure, but often holds trouble. I must see this for myself, Dolly. She set her knitting aside and resolved to visit the manor, her mind already threading the new clue into the pattern. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to Willowby Forge, her basket carrying a small jar of honey as a pretext for her visit. The manor's gate creaked under her touch, and she noted a fresh scratch on the iron, as if forced in haste. The gravel path crunched under her sensible shoes, and the laurel bushes, heavy with dew, seemed to whisper as she passed. Spotting Miss Marple. Arthur Hargrove's behind this. He was after the will, I'd wager, and when he didn't find it, he took the jewels instead. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. A bold assumption, Constable, but jewels are easier to carry than motives. Have you examined the lock closely? She stepped forward, peering at the safe. The scratches were uneven, as if made by an amateur, and a faint green thread, matching the laurel leaves, clung to the edge. She made no comment, but her mind filed it away, alongside the thread from Mrs. Price's apron. Mrs. Price hovered nearby, her hands twisting the duster. Mr. Arthur's been nothing but trouble, she muttered. Always asking the Colonel for money, gambling debts, I heard. He was in the study that evening, you know, before he went to the pub. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the sugar bowl on the tea tray, its lid still askew. Beside it, the almond shell remained, its presence increasingly peculiar. And you, Mrs. Price, she said gently, did you notice anything unusual that night? Perhaps a sound or a visitor? Mrs. Price flushed, her eyes darting to the window. Nothing, miss. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after the Colonel's tea. The house was quiet. Her voice was firm, but her fingers betrayed her, crumpling the duster's edge. As Slack continued his tirade about Arthur, Miss Marple slipped out to the manor's garden, where the laurel bushes grew thick. There, near the gate, she found another clue, a crushed almond shell, half buried in the soil, its bitter scent faint but unmistakable. Cyanide, she knew, could be extracted from such seeds, though it required skill. She glanced at the manor, wondering who among its visitors had such knowledge. Dr. Haydock's garden came to mind, but so did Mrs. Price's tidy herb plot, tucked behind the kitchen. Her next encounter was at the village green, where Arthur Hargrove was pacing, his cigarette smoke curling like a question mark. Miss Marple, he said, his voice edged with defiance. I suppose you've heard I'm the villain now. That safe business is, she soothed, her eyes catching a faint scratch on his hand, as if from a thorn or a lock. Truth, like a good hymn, rises above the noise. Did you visit the manor recently? He hesitated. Only for pastoral calls. The Colonel was distant, but I never went near his safe. His tremor suggested otherwise, but Miss Marple let it pass, her mind weaving connections. By afternoon, she met Miss Lavinia Blackwood at the Blue Boar Inn, her pearl earrings glinting as she sipped tea. Miss Marple, she said coolly, I hear the village is in a tizzy over a safe. I assure you, I was in London by evening. My train ticket proves it. Of course, Miss Marple replied, noting the faint jasmine scent and a smudge of red lipstick on Miss Blackwood's cup. But old debts can linger. like a melody one can't forget. Did the Colonel mention anything specific? Miss Blackwood's smile tightened. Just old promises, long broken. Nothing worth killing for. Her poise was impeccable, but her eyes darted, as if guarding a secret. Dr. Haydock, encountered on the green, was pruning his foxglove. "Miss Marple," he said, chuckling, "you're relentless. Heard about the safe? Sounds like a desperate act, not a doctor's style." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes on the foxglove. "But knowledge of poisons is a sharp tool, Doctor. Cyanide, for instance. Could it come from a garden?" He shrugged. "Possible, but tricky. Almond shells maybe, but you'd need expertise. I stick to healing, not harming." His casual tone rang true, but Miss Marple wondered. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her thoughts heavy. The tampered safe, the green thread, the almond shell, the forged letter. Each was a shadow lengthening over the truth. Arthur's alibi held, but his ink-stained cuff hinted at hidden actions. The vicar's scratch was curious, but his motive weak. Miss Blackwood's train ticket seemed solid, but her guardedness suggested more. Dr. Haydock's knowledge was convenient, yet Arthur Hargrove's inky cuff. Reverend Clement's nervous tremor. Miss Blackwood's guarded poise. Dr. Haydock's foxglove garden. The tampered safe and the discarded vials were like scattered beads, waiting for her to string them into a coherent necklace. Today, she sensed, might bring a glimmer of truth to light. The village was abuzz with the latest scandal. The tampered safe at Willowby Forge, its jewels untouched, but the will still missing. At the breakfast table, Dolly, Miss Marple's maid, was brimming with news. "Miss Marple, they're saying the safe was forced open with a hairpin, and Mrs. Price is in a state, accusing Arthur of sneaking about. But he's blaming her, saying she's been too cozy with the Colonel's papers." Dolly's eyes sparkled, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her fingers pausing over her teacup. "A hairpin, you say?" she murmured, her mind turning. "How curious. Like a simple tool turned to mischief. Reminds me of the Langston case, where a hairpin unlocked more than a door." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "I must attend the village fete today, Dolly. Gossip flows freely there, and I suspect it holds more than idle chatter." The fete was in full swing on the village green, with bunting strung between oaks and tables laden with jam tarts and lemonade. Children darted about, clutching toffee apples, while villagers exchanged pleasantries and sidelong glances. Miss Marple, her basket now carrying a knitted scarf as a donation, mingled with the crowd, her ears attuned to the undercurrents of conversation. At the tea stall, she overheard Mrs. Weatherby, the shopkeeper, whispering to a neighbor. "I saw Miss Blackwood talking to Dr. Haydock near the church yesterday. Something about an old debt. Looked mighty secretive, if you ask me." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes narrowing. An old debt could mean many things. Money, promises, or something darker. She made her way to the church stall, where Reverend Thomas Clement was selling hymnals, his hands trembling and glinting. "Enjoying the fete? Quite a change from London's bustle." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "But villages have their own dramas. I heard you spoke with Dr. Haydock recently. Something about a debt?" Miss Blackwood's smile tightened, her fingers adjusting her gloves. "A private matter, long past. The Colonel owed me a sum from our India days, nothing worth this fuss. Her eyes darted toward the manor, and Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in her hand, as if the debt carried more weight than she admitted. As the fete wound down, Miss Marple made her way to Willowby Forge, her scarf delivered and her curiosity undimmed. Mrs. Price greeted her at the door, her face pale, her apron crisp, but her hands fidgeting. "Miss Marple, you're tireless," she said, forcing a smile. "More questions about the safe?" "Just a word, my dear," Miss Marple said, stepping into the study. The safe still gaped open, its scratches stark in the daylight. She bent closer, her eyes catching a glint of metal, a hairpin, bent and discarded, tucked beneath the rug. "How careless," she murmured, straightening. "Mrs. Price, you mentioned Arthur was in the study that evening. Did he touch the safe?" Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Not that I saw, miss, but he was always nosing about the Colonel's things. I found him once near that desk looking shifty." Her voice was sharp, but Miss Marple noted a smudge of dirt on her sleeve, matching the soil near the laurel bushes. Constable Slack arrived, his boots loud on the floor. "Miss Marple," he said, exasperated. "Still here? We're closing in on Arthur. The hairpin's his style, city lad like him. And that forged letter points to the vicar, but I reckon it's a distraction." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps, Constable, but distractions like weeds often hide the truth. Have you tested the sugar bowl yet?" She gestured to the tea tray where the bowl sat, its lid askew, the almond shell beside it. Slack frowned. "Sugar bowl? The poison was in the tea, Dr. Haydock said, postmarked from India. They spoke of a debt, not financial but personal, tied to a scandal long buried. One letter mentioned Lavinia, hinting at a broken promise. Miss Marple tucked the discovery away, her mind racing. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The poison's method clarified. Cyanide in the sugar bowl, not the tea, explained the almond shell and powdery residue. Mrs. Price's herb garden, with its bitter almonds, was a likely source, and her calloused hands suggested she'd handled more than time. The hairpin and green thread pointed to her, but the forged letter and vicar's scratches muddled the picture. Arthur's ink and Miss Blackwood's debt hinted at hidden roles, while Dr. Haydock's knowledge lingered like a shadow. "People are like lanterns," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking. "The light is dim, but it reveals the truth in time." Tomorrow she would narrow the net, for the glimmers of truth were growing brighter, and the shadows of Willowby Forge were beginning to fade. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Net. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the autumn mist to paint the village in soft hues of gold and gray. The scent of damp leaves and freshly baked bread drifted through the air, mingling with the faint chime of the church bell. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat at her breakfast table, her knitting idle as she sipped tea and pondered the mystery of Colonel Reginald Hargrove's death. The cyanide poisoning at Willowby Forge, the shattered teacup, the tampered safe, and the hidden letters from India were pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape. The clues: Mrs. Price's green thread, Arthur Hargrove's inky cuff, Reverend Clement's trembling hands, Miss Blackwood's guarded debt, Dr. Haydock's foxglove garden, the discarded vials, and the forged letter were like stitches in a tapestry. and Miss Marple sensed the small pot of lavender as a pretext for her visit. The iron gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she noted a fresh scuff mark on the gravel, as if someone had passed in haste. Mrs. Edith Price opened the door, her face pale, her apron crisp, but her hands twisting nervously. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained. "You're kind to come again. It's been nothing but trouble here, with the constable and his accusations." "Trouble does have a way of lingering," Miss Marple replied, stepping into the hall. "I heard about your cookbook, Mrs. Price. An almond recipe, was it?" Mrs. Price flushed, her fingers tightening on her apron. "Just an old recipe, miss. Almond biscuits, nothing more. I don't know why Slack's making a fuss." Her eyes darted to the study, and Miss Marple noted a faint smudge of flour on her sleeve, odd for a morning visit. In the study, the air was heavy with the scent of old leather and wax polish. The safe still gaped open, its scratches stark, the hairpin now bagged by Slack as evidence. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the tea tray, where the sugar bowl sat, its lid askew, the almond shell beside it. "Mrs. Price," she said gently, "did you ever use bitter almonds in your baking? They have such a distinct flavor." Mrs. Price's hands stilled, her face paling further. "Bitter almonds? No, miss, never. The Colonel didn't care for them." Her voice was too quick, and Miss Marple tucked the response away like a loose thread in her knitting. Constable Slack arrived, his boots echoing in the hall. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of frustration and respect. "Still sniffing about? That recipe's got Mrs. Price in hot water. Bitter almonds could yield cyanide, Dr. Haydock says. But I'm betting on Arthur. That hairpin's his style, and he's got the motive." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "Motives are like shadows, Constable. They shift with the light. Have you considered the letters from India? Gardner might manage it." His calloused hands paused, and Miss Marple noted a faint scratch, as if from a thorn or a lock. Her next stop was the church, where Reverend Thomas Clement was arranging hymnals, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice trembling. "This recipe business, it's making things worse. I had nothing to do with the Colonel's death, I swear." "Of course," she soothed, noting a fresh ink smudge on his cuff. "But small sins, like borrowing funds, can cast long shadows. Did you ever see Mrs. Price with the Colonel's stationery?" He hesitated, his hands shaking. "Once, maybe, she brought him paper for a letter. But I never thought." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple wondered if his tremor hid more than guilt over church funds. At the Blue Boar Inn, she spotted Arthur Hargrove, his cigarette smoke curling in the air. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile tight. "I hear I'm still the villain. That hairpin's not mine. I don't even use them." "Naturally," she said, her tone light. "But alibis, Mr. Hargrove, are like lace, lovely but easily torn. Did you ever see your uncle with bitter almonds?" Arthur's eyes flickered. "He hated almonds, said they reminded him of India." "I didn't touch that safe, Miss Marple. Someone's framing me." His inky cuff caught her eye again, a detail that nagged at her. Miss Lavinia Blackwood was at the inn's tea table, her fur stole draped over a chair. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, her pearl earrings glinting. "This village is full of rumors. I'm leaving for London tomorrow. Nothing more to say here." "Leaving so soon?" Miss Marple asked, noting the faint jasmine scent and a smudge of red lipstick on her teacup. "Old debts can linger, Miss Blackwood." "Did the Colonel ever mention a locket?" Miss Blackwood's hand froze, her smile faltering. "A locket? No, nothing like that. Just money owed." Nervous haste betrayed her. Yet the forged letter and locket hinted at another hand, perhaps working with her. "People are like nets," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking softly. "They catch what's meant to be caught, but the knots reveal the maker." Tomorrow she would confront the truth, for the net was tightening, and the glimmers of truth were now a steady light. Chapter 9. The Unveiling. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blue, streaked with wisps of cloud that glowed faintly in the fading light. The village, nestled in its quiet hollow, seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Willowby Forge, its stone walls shadowed by ancient oaks, stood like a silent witness to the tragedy of Colonel Reginald Hargrove's death, poisoned by cyanide, his teacup shattered, his secrets laid bare. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close against the autumn chill, sat by her cottage fire, her knitting idle as her mind wove the final threads of the mystery. The clues, the green thread, Arthur's inky cuff, Reverend Clement's tremor, Miss Blackwood's guarded debt, Dr. Haydock's foxglove, the tampered safe, the India letters, the almond recipe, had formed a pattern. And tonight, in the Manor's drawing room, she would unveil the truth. Miss Marple had invited the suspects to Willowby Forge under the guise of a neighborly gathering, her basket carrying a tin of shortbread as a pretext. The air was thick with tension as she arrived, the Manor's hall lit by flickering lamps that cast long shadows. Mrs. Edith Price opened the door, her face pale, her hands twisting her apron. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "I didn't expect such a crowd tonight. It's unsettling." "Truth can be unsettling, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "But it's like a good seam. It holds everything together." She noted a fresh smudge of flour on Mrs. Price's sleeve, a detail that confirmed her suspicions. In the drawing room, the suspects gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. "Marple," he said, his tone sharp. "Some sort of parlor game?" "No game, Mr. Hargrove," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Murder is a serious matter, like a dropped stitch that unravels a whole garment. Let us begin with the facts. The Colonel was poisoned with cyanide, hidden in the sugar bowl, not the tea. The almond shell, the powdery residue, these were clues, not accidents." Mrs. Price gasped, her hands clutching her apron. "The sugar bowl! But I prepared the tea myself, nothing amiss." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "Indeed, Mrs. Price. But your herb garden grows bitter almonds, and your recipe book held instructions for more than biscuits. Cyanide, carefully distilled, was your weapon, wasn't it?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Mrs. Price, whose face drained of color. "That's nonsense," she cried, her voice trembling. "I served the Colonel for 20 years. Why would I harm him?" Miss Marple's expression softened, but her words were firm. "Motive, my dear, is often buried deep, like a root in winter soil. The Colonel was a hard man, wasn't he? Unpaid wages, harsh words, and a secret that cut deeper. A betrayal from long ago. Those India letters, mentioning a broken promise, weren't just about Miss Blackwood, were they? You and the Colonel had a history, a youthful romance in India, ended by his marriage to another. Miss Blackwood's hand froze on her teacup, her eyes wide. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "Only the truth," Miss Marple said, turning to her. "Your debt was a distraction, Miss Blackwood, though your locket, mentioned in the letters, tied you to the Colonel's past. You were a red herring, carefully placed. And you, Reverend," she said, facing Clement, "your borrowed funds and inky cuff suggested guilt, but your sin was small, a distraction from the real crime." Reverend Clement stammered, I only meant to help the church." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. Note you hid. Not a shopping list, but a recipe for poison was the final thread." Mrs. Price collapsed into a chair, sobbing. "He promised to marry me all those years ago in India," she whispered. "But he chose wealth, left me to serve him like a maid. The wages, the insults, it built up, Miss Marple. I couldn't bear it anymore." Constable Slack stepped forward, his face a mix of astonishment and respect. "Mrs. Price, you're under arrest for the murder of Colonel Hargrove." He glanced at Miss Marple, shaking his head. "How did you know, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Human nature, Constable. It's like a garden. Tend it carefully and the weeds reveal themselves." Mrs. Price's calloused hands, her nervous haste. The almond recipe, they told a story of bitterness, not biscuits. As Slack led Mrs. Price away, her sobs echoing in the hall, the other sat in stunned silence. Miss Blackwood's poise softened, her eyes misty. "I never knew," she murmured. "He hurt so many of us." Reverend Clement clutched his hymnal, his voice shaky. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've saved my reputation." Arthur stubbed out his cigarette, his face pale. "I thought it was me they'd pin it on. You're a marvel, Miss Marple." Dr. Haydock nodded, his grin genuine. "Never underestimate a village spinster, eh?" Miss Marple rose, her basket in hand, her demeanor calm. "The truth is always there, waiting to be seen, like a star in the daytime sky. Good evening, all." She stepped into the night, the manor's shadows parting before her, the village settling back into its quiet rhythm. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. The red herrings, the forged letter, the ghostly figure, the tampered safe, had been Mrs. Price's desperate attempts to mislead. The India letters, the locket, the vials, all distractions. But the sugar bowl, the green thread, and the all arranged a tray of tea and biscuits, her knitting tucked beside her armchair. Today, she had invited Constable Slack for morning tea, knowing his brisk efficiency would demand a clear explanation of the tangled threads she had woven into truth. As she poured boiling water into the teapot, the cottage door opened, and Dolly, her maid, ushered in the constable. Slack's face was a mix of awe and exasperation, his notebook tucked under his arm as he removed his hat. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "I still can't fathom how you pieced it together. Mrs. Price, of all people. I'd have bet my badge on young Arthur." Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling as she passed him a cup of Earl Grey. "Human nature, Constable, is like a garden, full of surprises, if you know where to look." Mrs. Price's confession was the final bloom, but the roots were there all along. Shall I explain? Slack nodded, sipping his tea, his pen poised. Please, Miss Marple. I need to get this straight for the report. She leaned back, her hands folding neatly in her lap. Very well, let us start with the method. The Colonel was poisoned with cyanide. Not in his tea, as we first thought, but in the sugar bowl. The almond shell on the tray, the powdery residue. These were no accidents. Cyanide, you see, has that telltale almond scent, and Mrs. Price's herb garden grew bitter almonds, from which it can be distilled with care. Her recipe book, with its almond biscuit instructions, was more than a cookbook. It was a blueprint. Slack's eyes widened. But how did you know it was the sugar, not the tea? Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. The tea was prepared as usual, but the sugar bowl's lid was askew, and the residue suggested tampering. Dr. Haydock confirmed cyanide's presence, and the almond shell was a careless slip. Mrs. Price, with her calloused hands from gardening, had the means. But motive, Constable, is where the story deepens. She sipped her tea, her voice steady. Mrs. Price served the Colonel for 20 years. Her apron and the laurel bushes, where she'd been working. She hoped to implicate Arthur, whose inheritance motive made him an easy target. Slack leaned forward, his tea forgotten. And the hairpin? We thought it was Arthur's doing. A woman's touch, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Price used it to pry the safe, leaving jewels to suggest theft. But no will. Another misdirection. The ghostly figure seen near the manor was likely her, slipping through the bushes to hide evidence, like the vials near the gate. Those vials, labelless, could have held cyanide, but they were meant to confuse. Slack frowned. What about the others? Arthur, the vicar, Miss Blackwood, Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Each had their shadows, but none held the truth. Arthur's inky cuff came from writing to creditors, not forging letters. His alibi at the Blue Boar held, though his restlessness suggested guilt over debts. Reverend Clement's tremor and scratches were from nervous gardening, not murder. His sin was borrowing church funds, a minor fault. Miss Blackwood's debt was real, tied to a locket and a broken promise from India. But she was in London, her train ticket confirmed. Dr. Haydock's foxglove and knowledge of poisons were suspicious, but cyanide wasn't his method. His land dispute was a distraction. Slack set down his pen, his face a mix of admiration and disbelief. You saw it all, Miss Marple. The thread, the recipe, the letters. How? She smiled, her hands picking up her knitting, the needles clicking softly. Observation, Constable. Like watching a village fete. You see the games, but the real story is in the glances, the hesitations. Mrs. Price's fidgeting hands, her haste with the note she called a shopping list, her calluses. They told of a woman driven by bitterness. The green thread, matching the laurels, was her undoing, like a stitch that betrays the seamstress. Slack shook his head, sipping his tea at last. You've saved the village, Miss Marple. We'd have locked up Arthur. Almond recipe were the heart of it. People are like teacups, she mused, her needles clicking. Plain on the outside, but the cracks tell the story. She poured another cup of tea, the steam rising like a sigh, and gazed out at St. Mary Mead, where harmony, however fragile, had returned. The village would talk of this for years, she knew. The sinister colonel, the housekeeper's betrayal, the spinster who saw it all. But for Miss Marple, it was simply another pattern completed, another garden weeded. She smiled, her eyes bright, and turned her thoughts to her roses, which needed tending. Life, after all, went on, and St. Mary Mead was once again a place of tea and tranquility.